It's great to have you all here today. We need to make requirement of CSIS an emergency announcement. If there is an emergency, I'm the emergency officer, follow me. We don't expect any problems, but given that we're having a program today on hurricanes, one never knows. So this is a special public program on Hurricanes Irma and Jose and the massive international response that's already underway. We've all seen the pictures of the tremendous damage that's been done on Antigua and Barbuda, San Martin, the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Cuba, Florida, and elsewhere. And we shouldn't forget Hurricane Harvey. Disasters like these hurricanes always present an opportunity to refocus our efforts to see where we are doing well and where efforts need to be improved. Emergency response systems have been tested like never before in the U.S. and in the countries of the Caribbean. We've organized the program today to bring greater attention to both the impact of the hurricanes and to the critical local and international response. This is the latest in a series of panels, presentations, and publications that we've been doing on the Caribbean. 2 months ago, we published a report discussing the most important aspects of U.S. relations with the Caribbean. With Mexico and Canada, the Caribbean represents our third border. Our Caribbean effort has been led from the very beginning by Dr. George Fario, who is here in the audience today, who's had a long history of involvement at CSIS. George has been assisted by a great group of other senior advisors and associates, some of whom you'll see today, and by our great Americas program staff. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Sally, a friend of CSIS and the executive director of the Caribbean Central America Action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I want to thank everybody who came here today, everybody who's watching online. This is, of course, an important discussion. Caribbean Central American Action, we are a nonprofit. We're happy to work with CSIS on anything involving our region. And of course, when something like Irma happens, I think all of us who have an interest in the region, all of us who care about what's going on there, it's important that we all get together to talk about what the solutions are, what's happening. So again, I want to thank CSIS for making this forum possible. My job here is going to be easy. I'm going to be introducing our two distinguished speakers. I did want to make one comment, I think, before I do that. I think a testament to Hurricane Irma, I've been describing it as the United Nations of hurricanes. We have Dutch, French, Spanish, English, US, and independent states that have all been hit by this disaster, which I think brings particular focus on international coordination and on local coordination in terms of getting relief supplies and trying to figure out how to make it all work smoothly. So that being said, I also would like to recognize, in testament to the international nature, of course, Mr. Patrick Lachaussee, who is the first counselor for the Embassy of France, and I believe we may be having Miguel Velez, who is the first secretary at the Embassy of Cuba. Of course, both countries are impacted by the disaster. So my two fellow panelists today are on your right. Ambassador Sir Ronald Saunders. He's the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda to the United States. And just the bios are in here, but just very quickly, he is currently Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to the United States in the Organization of American States for Antigua and Barbuda. Before taking up this appointment, he was a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London in the UK, and a senior fellow at Massey College University in Toronto. He has been in the diplomatic service in England and Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, World Trade Organization, and countless other roles representing his countries. So that's Ambassador Sir Ronald Saunders. And before we go on, I'm going to do a quick introduction for Ambassador Henne Schoor. He's the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States, and he's had a 36-year career with the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, focusing his work on European Union and transatlantic relations. He's chaired various working groups in the fields of structural funds, common foreign and security policy, and was secretary of the EU Coordination Committee in the Netherlands. So that's the brief introduction of my fellow panelists, and now I'd like to turn to Ambassador Sir Ronald Saunders, who, of course, as the ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda, Barbuda was probably the most impacted nation by Hurricane Irma, and so we really want to hear as much as possible from the ambassador.
Thank you. Oh, I was hoping that would have been here. If you don't mind, I'll stand here because it gives me a place to put these pieces of paper on. Oh, I'm impressed by that Samson-like performance. I want to start this presentation, as I've done with almost every one of the similar presentations I've made on this matter over the last week. And that is by first expressing sorrow to the people and government of the United States of America. The damage done and the 18 lives that were lost as Hurricane Irma stormed through the state of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, coming on the heels of Hurricane Harvey, which had taken upward of 70 lives in Texas just weeks before, is a difficult thing. Those were 88 plus lives of people who, if they were your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, would have been a matter of personal grief to you. And that's the thing about hurricanes and about natural disasters. We could watch them on television and in the media with a certain sense of withdrawal. It's almost like a movie. But when it affects you yourself is when you understand how hurtful it can be. So I sympathize with the families of those people who are the unfortunate victims of the two mighty Category 4 hurricanes that thundered onto the shores of this country. I also want to say to this particular group that the phenomena of brutal, ferocious, and merciless storms that the world is now witnessing has led my country to believe that climate change is a reality and it is here to stay, despite all those who may say it's a fantasy of the Chinese or whatever other reason that people say that it doesn't exist. These storms know no borders. They cross them at will and with no fear of being turned away. There's no immigration officer that will say, no way, Jose, should Jose decide to come in this direction. They know no ideologies or embargoes. So Irma stalked through parts of Cuba before it went on to parts of the United States. Didn't know there was an embargo. They make no discrimination between small or large, or rich or poor. They see no white people or black people or any persons of any color in between. The destruction is ruthless, it's heartless, and it's pitiless. That is why no nation can stand apart from the reality of climate change or the effects of global warming. That is why, as year after year, we are confronted with a trail of death and destruction that is the aftershock of these storms. All our countries should resolve to put climate change high on our agenda and work toward mitigation against it and to build resilience. Now, I'd like to talk to you specifically about Antigua and Barbuda. Antigua and Barbuda separated by 28 miles. That 28 miles was significantly important to Antigua on this occasion, because while the eye of the hurricane went over Barbuda and the outer edges of it went over Antigua, Antigua did not receive the kind of damage that Barbuda did. There were two reasons for it. Not only was it the fact that we did not get the full effect of the hurricane, but it was also preparation. It is a kind of enforced preparation, if you like, because we've been suffering these hurricanes now since, bad ones, since 1995. In 1995, Hurricane Luis was a Category 5 hurricane, and it reduced Antigua to a snowless winter scene. If you can imagine a country, the tropics, that just went through the most cruel winter you can think about, in which there was no grass on the mountainside, no grass on the ground, no branches in the trees, and no leaves on non-existent branches. That was what Antigua was like in 1995, amidst the rubble of the houses, including my own, which was tossed into the sea within a matter of minutes. We rebuilt from all of that. And every time we rebuilt to higher standards and higher regulations. Had we not done that on Antigua, we would not be today still open for business, and we would not have been able to cope with the problem that we have of Barbuda. But to turn to Barbuda, for the first time in over 300 years, there is today not a living soul on Barbuda. A society of people who lived for generations on that island had to be plucked away from all that they own, all that they know, and all that defined them as a people. My government was compelled to evacuate all the 1,700 inhabitants of Barbuda and move them to Antigua. We had prepared for that possibility before this hurricane came along. We had ordered all the building material, all the dry foods, all of the medicines that we thought we would need in an emergency, and we had warehoused them in Miami, waiting to fly them into Antigua, which we were able to do 2 days after the hurricane passed, so that when we evacuated the people from Barbuda, we were able to address their immediate needs from our own resources. We did not have to wait for other countries and other agencies to help. But Hurricane Irma has mangled Barbuda in a way that none of us could have imagined. There is now no potable water, no electricity, and such buildings that are left are pitiful wrecks, incapable of providing shelter and dangerous to enter. Now, Barbuda is 62 square miles. This city in which we live, Washington, D.C., is 68 square miles, 6 square miles bigger than Barbuda. Hurricane Irma was 364 miles wide when it spread itself across the island, overwhelming it in size, strength, and ferocity. Its force was Category 5 plus, the strongest hurricane ever seen in our region, with winds gusting at 220 miles per hour. Neither Barbuda nor its inhabitants stood a ghost of a chance against so formidable and all-encompassing a monstrous power. Despite all that, Barbuda had one fatality, and that is again because the government had built a shelter, concrete roof, everything, and most of the population went to that shelter. A few people, of course, stayed behind. It was always difficult to get people to leave their homes, even in conditions like this. And one woman with a little child, a toddler, little boy, refused to leave her home until it was far too late, when her home began to crumble around her. She then decided to rush for the shelter. By then, the winds were strong enough to pluck that child from her hands. She didn't see it again until the next day, when he was found dead. But we will mourn that child for a long time. However, we've got to be thankful that the rest of the people survived. We, of course, could not leave people on Barbuda in those conditions. And even though the Barbudans themselves, amidst all that rubble and wreck, were reluctant to leave their homeland, we knew two things were compelling us to move them out. Not only the existing conditions on Barbuda, which could not sustain life, but Hurricane Jose, which was scheduled to travel on the same track as Irma and to hit Barbuda 2 days after it had already reduced it to rubble. And that was what compelled us to bring them. Now, I've spoken, but this story is better seen. And therefore, we've got a little video which I crave your indulgence for you to look at for a few minutes, and then I will wrap up this presentation with the current condition on the island.
Having survived the worst storm in living memory and knowing another is on the way, people are exhausted, hungry and just desperate to leave.
I don't know, I'm just waiting to get evacuated from here, and then I'm going to come back and try and salvage something and help. I don't know, my whole life is here, so...
We're not coping. We're definitely not coping. Everybody will tell you the same, they're not coping. Everyone is in the same situation, and nobody can help one another.
The core of the hurricane carved a cruel and deadly path through these streets. A 2-year-old died, drowned as her mother tried to move her to safer ground. But incredibly, the rest of the people on this island survived the storm's wrath.
Don't worry, we're going to get you off the island and we're going to get you to safety, and you'll be taken care of.
The Prime Minister has travelled from neighbouring Antigua to provide some reassurance.
Be patient, we're going to get you all out.
He knows this is a race against time before Hurricane Jose arrives in just a few hours. We heard him haggling for every boat, helicopter or plane to help with the evacuation.
Can it land here then?
But fear starts to spread that not everyone will get out in time. This woman's just been told she doesn't have a place on the next boat. The sheer horrifying scale of the devastation here means that barely a building is salvageable. That means that the whole island will have to be rebuilt. And the government has already admitted it simply doesn't have the money. The hope is that the funds will come from somewhere.
We're hoping that, friendly governments and international partners will step up to the plate and assist us. They should not see this as a form of, let's say, the Prime Minister and the people of Antigua and Barbuda coming with a begging bowl, cap in hand. This is a disaster, a national disaster.
The fragments of people's lives now lie in ruins. They can only hope that one day they will once again call this island home. But for now they must leave by any means possible, including this towed barge, and they don't know when they will return.
The night was restless, you couldn't get to sleep, and I think you was up all night trying to organize and keep things together. And then all of a sudden, the big crash came. And then it just started bringing down everything. Everything just started to decay and just crumble.
What's your house like?
Well, the roof is off and everything inside is destroyed. Like, they're gone.
What have you eaten in the last few days?
Hardly anything, because there's nothing to eat. You can't cook or anything, so you have to have like biscuit or tea or water or whatever. And that's about it.
What do you do now? Where do you go? What happens?
I have no idea, because everyone now is homeless. No one have nowhere to go.
Are you going to rebuild?
I don't know. I don't know whether that is a possibility. And if there is, then it won't be for a very long time.
I mean, how are you coping? Are you just managing to...
We're not coping. We're definitely not coping. Everybody will tell you the same, they're not coping. Everyone is in the same situation, and nobody can help one another. We can't help each other because everybody needs help.
That was the exodus of Barbudans to Antigua. Now, the people who came onto Antigua represent an increase overnight, suddenly and without warning, with no preparation, of 3% of our population. It must be very difficult for any country to suddenly have to cope overnight with an increase of their population of 3%. Think of the medical services, the school places. Amongst those people were 500 children. School years just started. We have to find school places for them in Antigua, in an already overtaxed educational system. We have had to find food and water, a modicum of decent living, but basically that is all it is. They're in shelters. Antiguans have been very generous and opened their homes and taken in many elderly people and young children, but the bulk of them are now living in government buildings in makeshift areas. They're, of course, very anxious to return to Barbuda. That's their home. That's where everything they have is. That's where their parents and their ancestors are buried. That's where they got married, had birthday parties. But it's impossible to do so now. And how long this will be like this, I have no idea. Because rebuilding Barbuda is going to cost us, at a reasonable estimate, in excess of $250 million. And we simply don't have that kind of money. And the reason why it's going to cost that is because we just can't go to Barbuda and build any buildings. We can't build what was there before and send people back to it. Because this hurricane season is not yet over. It'll go until the middle of November. And then it'll reoccur again next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. We rebuild it in the way in which it is now. Next year, another hurricane comes along, knocks the whole thing down, and we start all over again. And we come to the international community and ask for help. And after a while, they'll get fatigued. I am not even sure that as I speak to you now, this tragedy, about which everybody feels very emotional, will be a story any longer. The international media will have moved on to something else, some tweet or something that attracts their attention. And this will be forgotten. But it won't be forgotten for us, because we have to look after our people. My Prime Minister said in that video that we weren't asking for help with a begging bowl because we want. We're asking for it because we need. This is not just a disaster, it's a humanitarian crisis. And our hope is that the international community will be responsive in helping us to rebuild Barbuda in a sustainable way that will resist these hurricanes, which are clearly caused by climate change and global warming, which, as I said, is not only here to stay, but I suspect will get worse in the coming years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we'll turn to Ambassador Hura for some remarks, and then I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if I could invite you to.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I will, thank you for putting the lectern back up, so I will make use of it. Thank you very much. I'm, in a way, a different kind of animal, so to say, and Saint Martin is different from Antigua, Barbuda. But I think the sorrow, the disaster, the bottom line of all this is the same, and I would like to start off with saying the same as my colleague has said. You in this country have suffered the same fate, Harvey, Irma, as we have, and our heart goes out to you, like we know that your heart goes out to us in the Caribbean. And I say us because the Kingdom of the Netherlands is a kingdom of 4 parts. There are 4 independent parts of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and one of those parts is Saint Martin, an island that we share with France. Half of the island, or 40%, is Dutch. Roughly 40,000 people are living there. The other part is French. So if I say that I'm a different animal a little bit, I am not born, obviously, in Saint Martin. I'm born in the Netherlands, the European part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And in that European part, we have had our share of disasters, but a different share. We have had the share of the disasters of flooding in the Netherlands, so we can cope with floods. A hurricane of this magnitude was something totally new to us in the Netherlands. It's not new to our friends in the Caribbean. Actually, it's quite rare in Curacao and Aruba, and unfortunately Saint Martin, like Antigua, has experienced something similar before. If I tell you a little bit of what happened in St. Martin, yes, we had the wrath of the hurricane come over St. Martin. To give you some figures, 4 people died on St. Martin, 1 of them of natural causes and 3 deaths directly related to the hurricane. By the way, I'll speak on the Dutch part of St. Martin and not on the French part, the 40,000 people. More than 40 people injured, of which 11 seriously injured. I think of all the structures, the houses in St. Martin, 90% is damaged and probably 30% is damaged beyond repair. It's a severe loss. We are in a different situation because St. Martin being part of a wider kingdom, of course the other 3 parts of the kingdom were not touched by St. Martin. And I think the heartening thing that you can see is that the other parts of the kingdom, inclusive the part in Europe, have immediately pledged to the people of St. Martin, we will not abandon you. We are all part of one kingdom. We are 4 parts of one kingdom. We are there with you also in this moment of need. Our king went out to Curaçao last Sunday to visit people who had been evacuated from the island. He visited St. Martin on Monday, stayed overnight on the island, and went on Tuesday, yesterday, to the 2 other islands that are very close by, Stacia and Saba, small islands with 1,200, 1,300 people, and visited them as a sign of solidarity. And he reiterated that pledge, we are with you in your moment of need. Another country that was with us in our moment of need, I must say, was the United States. And let's be honest, if we want to talk about what do you do in the aftermath of something like that, we have been helped greatly and are still being helped by the United States. We have a regular contact, the French authorities, the Dutch authorities, and the United States working together what we can do for the island. Our first concern after the storm had passed was evacuation. And then evacuation of everybody who was in medical need. And the problem we have found out with evacuation is that you have to be strict and you have to make a list, and you have to make the list public, and you basically have to prioritize how you will evacuate. And of course the first one were the people in need, the medical people in need. And we evacuated in the Netherlands via Netherlands asset, but we mainly also evacuated via American asset. Big problem with the evacuation was that the airport of Saint Martin, Saint-Martin, is on the Dutch part of the island. The airport was severely damaged. The runway had to be cleared, and then there was no control tower anymore. There were no lights anymore. So after that the runway was cleared, it was clear that we could only fly during the day because there was no absence of lights and no control tower. And we immediately instituted that there were only military planes were going to fly. It was too dangerous for commercial flights, and we had to have a very strict order of how we would evacuate. So if there are some lessons to be learned, I think that is one. You have to be strict in your evacuation. Maybe one lesson earlier, prepositioning of assets. We had prepositioned some assets, both material but also 100-person military on the island, knowing that Irma was coming. I don't think anybody really realized how bad Irma would be. We have now scaled up our military from 100 to 500, and we will be at 700 by tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And that, in the end, is probably the amount of people that you need. But okay, nobody knew. This was the first time for all of us what the impact of something like that would be. Secondly, I must say, and I mentioned it quickly before, we have been greatly helped by the international cooperation. We are in this together with the French government, with whom we immediately established contact. We are in their, let's say, crisis team. They are in our crisis team. The Americans, by the way, are also in our crisis team, and I think that probably they will be there in the French crisis team as well, but I will not speak for them. We had close contact with the Brits, who were, of course, there on the British islands. We have tried to coordinate as much as possible. We have coordinated the evacuation flights. We also coordinate, for instance, with the French desalination plants. Water is a problem. We coordinate with the French desalination plants and with the Americans. We coordinate evacuation plants. We coordinate flight control, who comes in or out. We also coordinate, we have the only port. I'm happy to say that the port of St. Maarten is re-established anymore. We've had our first cruise ship coming in, not for a cruise, but for picking up people. That had more than 350 people going out, and we, if necessary, will get our second cruise ship in tomorrow to pick up the remainder. If I can give you a state of play, all the medical emergencies are out. All the family of emergency responders are out, which was a priority category for us. I think that of all the tourists that were there, which was our third priority group, probably 800 are left. We have gotten out by now more than 3,500 on flights and more than 500 by boat. There are sort of 800 roughly left. And then you come to the people who are permanent resident on the island. Some people want to leave. Some people want to stay. We would love them to stay because they have to rebuild the island, but okay, you cannot force them to stay. So we're talking with them now and see who has to be out. There are a number of students who were there. You had the American Medical College on the island with 600 students. Of course, these people want to go out. A big part of them, Americans, are already out on the American flights. So that is, as far as the evacuation is concerned, I think we are in a good spot by now. I think the evacuation, the emergency part will be done by tomorrow. But okay, let's be honest, that is 5-6 days before you have everybody out, but it's an island of considerable size. The water supply has been restored. People are drinking water from bottles. We have the desalination plants. Also on the two smaller islands, Saba and Statia, water supply is there. The food supply has been there, is restored. You'll get, in 1 or 2 weeks, you get a problem with food. Because then the food supply, you know what, all the food packages that you're sending, then will run out, and then you will say, okay, then you go back to the normal food supply. That will be a problem, but we have time to address that. Because the port is open, you will be able to address that. Communication is a huge problem, like you have seen in Florida. Your telephones do not work, your internet connection is not there. I'm happy to say that I think that by tomorrow, we think that the telephone system, or the portable telephone system, will be restored in St. Maarten, which will make life for a lot of people a lot easier, and which also will make, for all those people who are missing their loved ones, they can now re-establish contact, and we found that very, very important, that the contact is there, and people can say, hey, I'm okay. The house is not, but I'm there, and that's the most important one. Your loved ones are safe. For the longer term, there is a huge rebuilding operation ahead of us. We realize that. We have assessment team. There's an American assessment team on the ground. There are Dutch assessment teams coming in this week. Anywhere between 1.1 and 2 billion dollars is the first assessment that we hear. And I think that will probably be a modest, on the modest side of their first assessments. There is a second problem. These are islands that live off tourism. I do not think that they will have a lot of bookings in the near future. So we have to make sure that they can survive. They have to have a source of income. All the more reason to rebuild the island as quickly as possible, because you do not only rebuild their dwellings, you rebuild their source of income. We are happy to say that not only there's an outpouring, in any case, in the Netherlands, of funds that are coming out from the people. There are donations now already to the National Red Cross of more than 3 million euros. We'll have what we call a telethon on Friday. All the national television channels and radio channels will band together and do a big program where people can phone in for their contributions. The government will, of course, make an assessment what the damage is and will make their contribution. We have seen already that the European Union, we are part of the European Union. The status of the French part is different from us, but still, it's clear that the European Union will step in to an amount we do not know yet. So we'll get international solidarity there, not only from the people from the region, but from the people from Europe, where there is a strong bond with Europe. Lastly, I want to relay, I heard a very nice interview this morning, a lady from St. Martin, whose house was still standing, no roof, heavily damaged. And she said, okay, what are you going to do now? And basically her answer was, I never liked the roof. This is a possibility to rebuild my house to my own design. This is an absolute disaster, but it's also an opportunity. We people in St. Martin have experienced this before. We'll pick up our shovels, we'll pick up our brushes, we will rebuild, and we will be better and more beautiful than we were before Irma. Thank you very much.
We are going to have to turn over to the next panel, but I didn't want to not give an opportunity for a couple of questions to be asked by the audience. I do have a couple of questions myself, but for the sake of time, if I could invite, sir.
Okay. Ambassador Sanders, my name is Charles Sharp. I'm with the Black Emergency Managers Association International.
I heard you better without that microphone.
I'm used to speaking.
You are perfect.
I'm with the Black Emergency Managers Association International here in Washington,
think
D.C., and it's for the mic, I know.
Yeah.
And my heart goes to the people of Antigua and Barbuda. In
I tell you
terms
what the
of...
problem is now. I don't understand a word you're saying.
Oh,
So the webcast is hearing you, but I can't.
okay. I'll try and get a
Yeah.
balance between the two. Regionally, how involved has SEDEMA? I really wanted to meet you at their upcoming conference in December, not in a situation like this, but are they highly involved? I'm in touch with Ron Jackson, the executive directors, and other members of SEDEMA, and how are they assisting you? I know NASA has a deployment plan for those who evacuated to return. Are you looking at that phased approach for people returning back at some time to help rebuild in a step-by-step approach?
Well, the answer to the question, and if I may deal with this one straight away, is that these are early days. This hurricane occurred on the 6th of September. We are not even a week away from that. Well, we are a week away from it now. But we have been preoccupied, as you can understand, with coping with 1,700 people and 3% increase in our population. We know that Barbuda has to be rebuilt, but how to rebuild it, in what way? The only thing that is definite about it is that it can't be rebuilt in the way that it was, that it has to be rebuilt to withstand these storms, which are clearly now here to stay. How we will plan that, how we will mobilize it, is something that people are discussing, but not in any definitive way. We will have to first send in teams of people to study that. We will need some expert help with it as well. I know that my Prime Minister has talked about now converting the island into a completely green technology, so that we move away from fossil fuels, we rely on renewable energy, we bury cable, we no longer have telephone poles and electricity poles in the air, which are susceptible to destruction by these hurricanes. Those are the kind of vague concepts that are around. But Barbuda could be a major tourist destination in the Caribbean. Its beaches are amongst the most beautiful. I think they may even be a little superior to yours. And we have pink sand beaches. You can stand in the water up to your neck and see your toes, and I'm not exaggerating this. It's why, for instance, it was the preferred place of holiday for Princess Diana. And the two boys, one of whom is now the second in line for the throne of Britain. But it has that potential. And it, of course, is used for that now. But in the future, we've got to ensure that the hotels are one thing. The living of how people live, the standard of their buildings, the quality of them, is going to be very important. And so, too, is going to be the utilities. So that's up the road. We've got an immediate problem. That one is very much niggling in our minds. We know we have to do it. But you're right, as we do it, it's going to have to be rephased resettlement. We can't send everybody back at the same time. But as homes get built and life becomes, we get all of the utilities back into place, there will be that phased resettlement. The Barbudans are anxious to get home. In fact, our problem is stopping them.
Oh, sorry. So thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Patrick Lachaussee from the French Embassy, and as my colleague on you, we are in a situation very sad situation for the population. And Irma struck several overseas territories last week, as you know. Martinique and Guadeloupe on September 5, with no more damages, but Saint Barthélemy and Saint Martin, the French part of Saint Martin, on September 6 and 7. And given the unprecedented violence of the hurricane and the importance of damages, 11 casualties, 35 for the time being, reconstruction costs evaluated to more than 2 billion euros, especially in Saint-Barthélemy and Saint-Martin, which were nearly totally devastated. 95% of the infrastructure were damaged. The French state swiftly deployed a wide range of means in order to assist the population in distress. But I don't want to make that speech because, as you said, Mr. Ambassador, we can have this meeting every year. We can continue to have this meeting every year. We can to expend a lot of means, a lot of human resources, a lot of billions of dollars, and the victims are always the same, the population. And we have to think all what we can do to fight this situation. And I think the first we can do is to continue to work against climate change, against the global warming of the oceans. Because if this hurricane have been so stronger, it's because the sea is so warm. You can see the scientific works everywhere in the world, the cooperation of the scientists, the meteorologists, all said us. The sea has been never warm like today. So the first, we have to do that. The second, I think we have to work all together closely to prevent with architect, with I don't know what, some other scientists to build some house, some infrastructure who can resist to the last for the next hurricane. And this is cost a lot of money. And we have to work all together very close to rebuild your island, our islands, for the population. I don't want to make this speech, but it's what I want to say with my heart, and I would like to be with you for the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So if one more, maybe? Okay, if there's one more question, we'll take that. If not, we'll close out this panel. Going. So I'd like to thank the two ambassadors. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned by what has happened as a result of Irma. Again, everybody, whether US, Kingdom of the Netherlands, France, Britain, and the independent territories in the Caribbean were all affected. There's a lesson about resilience to be learned, about how can we make the islands more resilient, how can we build back better, to Ambassador Saunders' point about are we going power lines underground, phone lines underground, everything that can be done to make the countries more resilient. But I think to the point about climate change, as the waters continue to rise, you can't be resilient against sometimes a 50-foot ocean swell. So there are a lot of considerations that are out there about how we build back better. But I think I would like to close on that note so we can turn over to the next panel. But I would just ask all of you in the room who are here today, who are watching online, if there is anything you can do to contribute to the recovery of our countries in the region, that will all be appreciated, and we look forward to working with you as we won't forget about this 2 weeks from now or a year from now. This is going to be a long-term process. So all of the friends who are here, thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you and working with you.
Thank you. Schneider, I'm a senior advisor here at CSIS, and I'm pleased to welcome the second panel. We've just heard from the distinguished ambassadors what is a very stunning and really a very depressing report on the magnitude of the impact of Hurricane Irma on their islands, as well as others on Cuba, on Puerto Rico, on the British Virgin Islands, on the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it's clear that the vulnerabilities, both countries small and large as the United States, to the power of nature in this situation. We have with us today two distinguished individuals who can talk about the response, particularly in this case of the U.S. response, both with respect to immediate relief and hopefully looking down the road. As we've just heard, there's going to be an incredible need for coordinated support and cooperation for the reconstruction, for the rebuilding in a way that takes into account the threats and dangers of climate change in the region. And for that, we have Margie Bond, Deputy Director of the Office of Caribbean Affairs at the State Department,
and James Fleming, who's USAID's Caribbean Hurricanes Response Director at the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA, at USAID. Margie's had a distinguished career at state, including her previous assignment as Deputy Political Counselor in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and before that, some 4 years in the State Department's International Organizations Bureau. She's a Harvard graduate with a master's from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, and one of the most impressive elements of her career was her work as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And James Fleming, who also began his development career the right way as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon after graduating from Kenyon College in physics. He joined OFDA in 1999 and worked as the Operations Division Chief responsible for the disaster assistance response teams. Those DART teams, I worked closely with them in Haiti and after Hurricane Mitch in Central America, and I value greatly their work. James now is USAID's Division Chief for disaster response in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia at OFDA. And we'll begin with Markie.
Good afternoon, and thank you, CSIS, for inviting me to represent the State Department here at this panel discussion today. And first of all, on behalf of the State Department, I want to extend our deepest sympathies to all those who've suffered losses because of Hurricane Irma. We share you in your grief, and we are living this disaster with you ourselves. I think this roundtable today is an important opportunity to reaffirm our united stance with the Caribbean and with those affected by the hurricane. Since Hurricane Irma's first landfall in Antigua and Barbuda, to the heartbreaking damage it caused in the British Virgin Islands and throughout St. Martin, the U.S. Department of State has worked in lockstep with other U.S. government agencies, in particular the Department of Defense and USAID, as well as with Caribbean governments and international partners to evacuate citizens from the United States and provide humanitarian support. Hurricane Irma has underscored our interconnectedness. As Sally mentioned, it's the UN of disasters, and it underscores the need for close cooperation in the region. By working together, we can move beyond the events of the past few weeks and recover and rebuild. The humanitarian support that the U.S. government is delivering and will continue to deliver in the coming days, weeks, and months will address the most pressing needs of the Caribbean people. But even as we respond to the immediate humanitarian needs of the crisis, we already are looking ahead to how do we address lessons learned, as Ambassador Saunders has mentioned, as the ambassador from the Netherlands has mentioned. We need to look at how we work going forward and how do we mend the deeper, longer-lasting wounds beyond just the cleanup. As you know, or many of you may know, in June of this year, we completed a comprehensive strategy to increase our engagement with the Caribbean. The strategy is called Caribbean 2020. The disaster assistance that we are providing now is in line with that commitment. But in Caribbean 2020, our strategy, we also pledged to work with Caribbean countries going forward to address issues of the resilience, of emergency response capacities, and of infrastructure so that we can respond better to major natural disasters like Hurricane Irma. We understand that there is a lot left to be done to determine the extent of the damage. As others have mentioned, we are still in the assessment phase. We need to continue to support those seeking shelter. We need to continue supplying relief supplies. But moving forward, our focus needs to start to shift from rescue to recovery, including robust humanitarian support. And I know these are issues that are going to be discussed more by James after me. But before I turn to James, I did want to take a moment to discuss a little bit about the U.S. government's response efforts in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane. Before the storm hit, the department had begun monitoring Hurricane Irma as it formed off the coast of Africa in late August. And we issued travel warnings to U.S. citizens in the path of the hurricane. We authorized departure for U.S. Embassy personnel in Haiti, Cuba, the Bahamas, and the Dominican Republic. We are very grateful to our consular wardens in the field, the region's tourism industry, and others who helped us to pass this urgent message. It alerted many to prepare and others to change or delay travel plans. We then stood up a 24-hour task force to facilitate the evacuation of U.S. citizens in need, to provide support to U.S. missions overseas, and to coordinate, and this is probably one of the most important parts, is to coordinate U.S. government assistance with our interagency colleagues and our international partners. I personally served on our task force on several of our shifts after it's become 24 hours task force. So I can tell you that at every level at the State Department, the commitment has been there. Everybody has been standing up to provide support to this relief effort. My last update that I received from the task force indicates that our efforts so far have led to the evacuation of more than 2,300 people from St. Martin, including more than 300 people evacuated by Royal Caribbean and 2,000 by U.S.-provided air evacuations, including military support and other support. To further support evacuation efforts in Tortola, San Juan, and St. Martin, we have positioned a number of our consular officers, both from the U.S. and from our missions in the regions, to Puerto Rico and Curacao and other posts in the Caribbean, and evacuation flights remain underway. We are extremely grateful during this whole event and the aftermath to our colleagues at the Department of Defense, as well as our Dutch, French, and British authorities for their cooperation. For more specific information about travel, about evacuations and travel and shelters and services to Americans and citizens, I refer that people viewing and who have questions and specifics about each of the individual countries, that they look at travel.state.gov on the website, the State Department website. And finally, in conclusion, I want to thank you for your continued support to the U.S. and Caribbean cooperation, particularly CSIS, with the Caribbean ambassadors, the diaspora, Sally Yearwood for her endless efforts as well, and many others who have directly shaped the Caribbean 2020 strategy that we are now beginning to implement. And as we move forward in our relief efforts, we will continue to rely on you as our partners to build on our strategy, chart a path to an even more robust relationship between the United States and the Caribbean. So thank you, CSIS, for organizing this event. And again, our hearts go out to our friends and family in the Caribbean who are going through this devastating disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you. James?
Thanks. Well, first, thanks to Mark and CSIS for the invitation to come and talk to you today and have a discussion. At USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, our responsibility is to lead the U.S. government's disaster response for the people affected around the world by disasters. And this is a disaster that we could see coming, as mentioned, at least a week ahead of time. So one of the things that we did even before the disaster is prepare as much as we could in advance. And so what that meant for us is we pre-deployed our disaster professionals across the Caribbean to our best guess to where the storm would have the greatest impact. So we placed people in Haiti, Dominican Republic, and in Barbados, where we could get to any of the other islands that were affected. One of the other things that we did is we have local consultants in almost every country in the Caribbean, and we activated all of those local consultants, and they are our eyes and ears and coordinate very closely with government emergency management agencies throughout the region. Also, what we did is we prepared airlifts of commodities to be able to respond very quickly to wherever the storm impacted greatest. Well, as these hurricanes go, they never follow the exact track that you expect. So our staff, after seeing where the storm was going, we shifted our staff really away from Haiti and the Dominican Republic toward the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, and then St. Martin as well. And so at the moment, we have disaster assistance response team members on Bahamas, on Antigua, as well as on St. Martin. So the way our assistance, the United States assistance, is triggered, it's triggered by a request from the affected country. So we have received to date 4 disaster declarations, which are issued that initiates our assistance. We've received disaster declarations from the Bahamas, from Antigua and Barbuda, from Holland, and from France. And I've worked at USAID for 19 years, and I think this is the first time that I recall receiving disaster declarations from the Netherlands and from France. But wherever we receive a disaster declaration, I feel personally that it's actually an honor to receive a request for help. And for our teams to go there that's what we're trained to do, and we enjoy doing that. So this is what we do. So when we go into a country, we recognize that the lead for that disaster response is the local government. And so our job as Americans is not to take over, but is to support that local government. So when our disaster assistance response teams arrive in the Bahamas, we're coordinating with the Bahamas government first and foremost. We also coordinate with regional entities. There was a question earlier about the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. We coordinate with them. But we also have a job is to coordinate the entire U.S. government response. So we coordinate with Department of State, Department of Defense, any other U.S. government agency that has a role in that disaster response. Then we work with UN organizations, international NGOs, national government, non-governmental organizations, local non-government organizations to actually start implementing assistance. So far, what the United States has done in terms of disaster response, we have released an initial amount of funds to each of the 4 countries from which we have received a disaster declaration. So we have provided an initial amount of $100,000 to all 4 countries. Usually that's channeled through the local Red Cross for immediate life-saving assistance in that country. What we have also done is we have dispatched 2 relief flights that are arriving tomorrow, one in Antigua and one to the Bahamas. These relief flights are full of whatever that country needs. In these cases, it includes shelter materials, it includes blankets, hygiene kits, household items, water containers, and so forth. We also have received a request for water treatment from St. Martin. And what we did is look through the U.S. government to who could provide this type of desalinization. So in this case, it was the Department of Defense that had this equipment. So we, in turn, asked the Department of Defense to provide this equipment. A couple of these reverse osmosis purification units, or ROPUs, are being delivered immediately with more on the way. What we're also doing is it's clear that this is in the early stage of the disaster response. So our teams are on the ground conducting assessments and looking for gaps and ways to respond in the future. And the last point I'll make before turning it over to question and answers is that not only do we do response, and response is very important when lives are on the line, but you've heard a number of comments and questions about preparedness. That's an essential part of any disaster response is what you can do ahead of time. And this is a big part of what USAID does, is disaster response and help communities become more resilient to disasters around the world. And I have a personal saying is that how we honor the people who have been affected by disasters is doing better the next time. Learning lessons for response and preparedness that we can put in place. And again, that's how we honor those who've been affected by disasters. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have questions from the audience.
Charles Sharp again with Beaman International. In terms of regional coordination, USAID, I also know that the ASEAN, Association of South Asian Nations, they're also contributing highly to rebuilding of the Caribbean. Who's coordinating that effort? Or is it like a free-fall? I'll go like that. Is it a free-fall for a lot of NGOs? Who's coordinating them all, making sure they're coming in, the money is being spent at the community level? That's the key to rebuilding to me.
Yeah, there are a lot of layers to that question. Well, what I would say first is that the responsibility is that sovereign territory. So if it's Bahamas, the Bahamian government is responsible for all the assistance that comes into their country and coordinating that. A lot of times, if a country has exceeded its capacity to coordinate on its own, a lot of times they'll ask the UN, as an example, to come in and help coordinate. And the UN has lots of coordination mechanisms. I'm not aware that any of these countries have asked for that type of assistance yet, but it's an option should they need it. I think the other thing that you're talking about is the principles under which assistance is provided. And I think one of the core tenets of humanitarian assistance is that you have to involve the people that you're helping with the design of a program. So any intervention that you're doing, it can't be done appropriately unless the people who are receiving that assistance are part of the process. And any person who is responding internationally should be operating under those principles to ensure that that's the proper way.
Other questions?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jillian Marcel, and I am here representing a research and technology park from the U.S. Virgin Islands. One of the things about the tech park that I represent is that it is completely commercially funded. And so the question that I have is, as part of thinking differently about how we respond to this disaster, is there a role for the private sector? Because there are technology companies, there are 50 companies in my organization that are ready and willing to be involved in the response and the recovery. And I would be very pleased to hear from you as to how we might work with you to organize that. Thank you.
Sure. I think in my career, this is something that has changed dramatically in the 19 years I've been involved in disaster response. That used to often be UN organizations and donor governments that were responding to disasters. I think that you're seeing a huge influence from the private sector, not only with funding, but with innovations and so forth in responding to disasters. And so I think it's absolutely vital, and it's a key piece of any response. And what I would say, first of all, is that any response, though, has to be tailored to what the needs are. It's not what you have to offer, but it's what is needed. And is there a match between what you have to offer and what the needs are? So, and again, going back to our first question, I think the first question, or first place to look is with that sovereign government to see what the needs are and see if you have a role to play in that. Then there's usually a coordination mechanism set up. Most countries have a national emergency management agency in which you can plug in and see if this fits within the response plan. So those are my initial suggestions.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to add also, and I think your question is very much matches up with the spirit of our Caribbean 2020 strategy, which I mentioned. What's different about this strategy is it really was developed hand in hand with the members of the diaspora, with NGOs, with CSIS, academia, and the private sector. We're working with us very closely as we develop this strategy. And we're now in the implementation phase, and we have several working groups advancing the pillars of the strategy. And there is an opportunity for continuing, and actually it's essential for the success of the strategy that the way it was drafted and imagined, that we continue that in the implementation process. So we would welcome working with members of the private sector, members of academia, the diversity of opinions that are here in this room as we do advance it. And the strategy is built around 6 pillars: security, diplomacy, prosperity, energy, health, and education. So we have 6 working groups working on those areas. And so if there's an area in there that you would like to plug into, I'll give you my business card at the end of the session and we can establish a contact. Thank you.
We have one additional question from Michael Matera.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Matera. I'm the director of the Americas program here. I wanted to thank everyone who's been a part of putting this together and carrying it off. But I have a question. We had a brief meeting before this event began with Miguel Velez from the Cuban embassy. And he talked about how Havana still doesn't have very accurate reports of the damage that apparently covers about 90% of the island. Apparently Cuba was hit much worse than many people know right now. What is USAID and OFTA's policy on assistance to Cuba? Have the Cubans asked for assistance? I assume that they haven't, but what is the policy on that? We're in a new state with Cuba, and I'm just wondering how that's reflected at this point in time.
Sure.
Thank you.
No, it's a really interesting question, and one of the things that I like about working in humanitarian assistance for the U.S. government is that we do have policies and authorities that allow us to work in any country around the world upon request. And I think, as I mentioned before, this is triggered by a request. And so far from the Cuban government, we have not received a request for assistance. But we are checking in with the embassy regularly just to ensure that there is no request. We don't expect one, but should there be one, we're prepared to respond in Cuba as well.
If I could, 2 additional ways that frequently the international community responds to natural disasters in Cuba is through ACHA at the UN, and also through the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and also through the Pan American Health Organization on emergency relief in the area of medical needs. And I would suspect that since there is both offices in Havana, I would assume that they would be engaged. And frequently they then reach out to the U.S. for special kinds of assistance that might be needed that those organizations might not have.
Thank you, Mark. David Lewis, Manchester Trade, and a senior associate here at CSIS. Any of you, but Mark especially with the 5 decades experience U.S. government, and Margie with the strategy. I'd like to go back to Sir Ambassador Saunders' piece on the indiscriminate movement of natural disasters over what I believe sometimes are artificial sovereign nation-state boundaries, particularly in the Caribbean, which is the one region in the world that is host to multinational countries. Europe is in the Caribbean, the United States is in the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. One of the issues we discussed in the briefings for the strategy was that on sort of very clear issues, security, counter-narcotics, economic development, it's very inadequate to think just of the sovereign nation states issues because these are now multinational issues. I'd wonder if anyone would comment about now with a natural disaster covering so many different sovereign states, local states, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands are not sovereign states. These are local states of the United States, and they're doing work in the region. What can it show us about what we need to do for assistance and other areas to really streamline that much more, particularly when you've got the 2 major economic and political powers in the world, Europe and the United States, right there in the Caribbean with massive amount of resources and expertise to shed light and help on this.
If you'd like to go, I'll comment after.
Well, I think the situation is of coordination is something that we've recognized for a time is always been a challenge, and it's something that we'll continue to need to address, especially in light of these kinds of natural disasters or transnational issues. And certainly in the strategy, we developed that with an eye of how does one country do everything? One country doesn't do everything. Everything has to be done in partnership. And it's not just partnership with other countries, it's partnership with all of the players that are in the arena. So I think that is something that we've recognized, that we want to continue to, we hope that this strategy is going to be a vehicle and a mechanism for advancing that kind of cooperation. But certainly every donor doesn't need to do the same thing in every country. We need to identify where are the comparative advantages, who has the value added, what is needed, as James said, what is it that the country itself needs, and what are it that the people themselves are asking for. And I think this is a step in the right direction in terms of advancing that kind of cooperative approach, whether it is to a transnational threat or whether it is to something like a disaster that we're living with. So it's a challenge that we recognize, and I think, and we welcome everyone's ideas on how do we address that.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a slightly different take on it, just specifically on disaster response. You know, I think your question is a really good one, and the way I think about this is maybe in the concentric circle model. Starting at the outside, you know, I had mentioned SEDEMA, that I think you're seeing more of these regional entities around the world. So the Caribbean, we heard about the Southeast Asian nations have one and so forth. This is something that at USAID, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, we have actually invested in. So we have provided funds to SEDEMA to build their capacity to respond regionally on behalf of the member nations. So that's the first circle, and I think that is important. I also think that this idea of building capacity to respond regionally is important, but also build capacity of nations to respond. So over time, we'll work with different governments and their emergency management agencies to help build their capacity so that you don't need as much international help. And we've seen success stories on this around the world. Last, I would say that this idea of capacity building, it can't stop at the national level within a country. And you refer to this, I think that getting down to the local municipalities and building capacity there, and they're always the first responders, is the local community, and building some capacity there is critical, especially for this life-saving idea. And it's something else that we have focused on over time, across the world, including in the Caribbean.
I would just add that there is now within CARICOM, there is a disaster relief committee that's set up, and that where USAID and State Department have been in touch and work together. The other point that we haven't mentioned is that there is now, and in fact, with respect to France and also with respect to the UK, the DoD has helped provide logistic support and engaged in cooperative action with them. And one of the things that you haven't mentioned is that USAID has pre-positioned a lot of the relief supplies in the Caribbean as well as in Florida, which unfortunately, I don't think very much of that was able to be accessed. But there is a lot of pre-positioning that's been done. Sally, you wanted to say something.
Me again. I just want to make a quick comment, because I think one of the things that's been interesting to watch over the last week is the fact that the private sector has been very responsive. I think for those of us who are on the follow the Caribbean Tourism Organization, Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, their information coming out on what's going on has been probably some of the best minute-by-minute accounts of how hotels have been reacting, what the damage has been. And for us at CCAA and the work we do with tropical shipping in terms of doing disaster management workshops, our focus has always been on private-public sector cooperation and coordination in preparing for a disaster. I think, and that's one of the things that we'll continue to stress, and I'll talk to you,
I'll give you a card.
about it. But so that's one thing, and I think I also wanted to point out, because we have Mark Reginelli in the audience from 84 Lumber, but that's another private sector entity that has been going in there and doing work and being ready to provide assistance. And so there are a lot of these private sector activities that are taking place and that are helping the transition. So I wanted to bring that up, and I think also worth mentioning the Caribbean Electric Utilities Corporation. They have protocols in place to provide assistance from one island to the other so that they can help each other rebuild. So there are a lot of these things that are taking place at the private sector level in collaboration with the public sector that are really making a difference. And I think, James, to your point, a lot of the work that's been done on the preparation has been, as somebody said to me today, it's paid off in spades, because the preparation has, I think, mitigated a lot of the problems that we could have had. And that's not to underestimate the huge challenges that are ahead, because the recovery is going to be, it's going to be a massive amount of work on the recovery. But I think that, but good work has been done, and now it gets into the harder work of recovering. So thank you.
I think the last question for this gentleman right here.
Well, since my name was mentioned, I figured I'd say a few things. When you think of 84 Lumber, you think of lumber. But that's really not what we're all about, especially in this disaster situation. No one mentioned the Turks and Caicos, which was hit by the eye of the storm as well. We have people on ground there. We gave them a $500,000 credit line for any of the supplies they need for emergency or reconstruction or water or Red Cross blankets or whatever else is needed. We gave a $250,000 credit line to the Bahamas government so that they would do the same thing. We've also asked Euler Hermes to write credit lines for all of the nations that were involved in the disaster and the hurricane so that we can help provide them with what they need up front. Building and construction is going to come a year from now. What we need to do right now is get the supplies that are needed to the countries that need them. We're going to put boots on ground in every nation that asks us to help them evaluate the construction that's there, what the needs are that are there. We did Chile after the earthquake. We did Mongolia with their GER district. We did the Caribbean. We did a presentation with Huntington Bank and Exim Bank. We're willing to go into the banking industry and help provide loans for people to rebuild their homes as well. So these are a lot of things that the private sector can do and get involved in with the help of others. So in the affected nations, we're offering our help to go in and work with their banking systems, work with their contractors, work with their governments to come up with the solutions, as you suggested earlier, on what to do better for the next time. So we're not just a lumber company. We really help work with people and countries and companies to try to get through the hard times.
Great. For you. I think on that relatively positive note, we're going to thank everyone who attended and thank our two panelists. Thank you very much.